Hello, everybody out there in internet land. Welcome to the Gamer Assembly Presents podcast. And today we are discussing the one thing, not the one ring. What is that one thing that you, as a game master, can bring to your table that brings something a little bit extra to the game? Is it something that makes it more fun, more interesting, speeds things along? What's your go-to trick? We have a panel assembled today. Myself, Bob Smith. With me are Brian LeBurge and Matt Miranda. So, do you want to give us a little bit of background? How long have you been GMing? What's your go-to game? Before we get into what your go-to move is, let's learn a little bit about each of us. So, Matt, how long have you been gaming? How long have you been running games?
So I've been gaming more than 20 years now, and my go-to game has been a variety of versions of Dungeons and Dragons. And I started running when I first got a starter kit for AD&D Second Edition. It was when I started playing at the same time, and we did round robin DMing. One person would run an adventure, the next guy would run a different adventure, and it would continue like this until we all decided we hated each other.
That sounds like the typical evolution of a teenage gamer group.
Exactly.
All right, Brian.
Yeah, so I've probably been running for about 20 years, more or less. I'm not honestly completely sure there. And like Matt, I got started in D&D, a D&D, and then I think D&D not being run properly, which was a lot of fun. People share that. But lately, I play a more diverse group of games, not really on anything in particular. I am running a Monster Hearts campaign at the moment.
Cool. I've wanted to play that for quite some time, but haven't been able to dig in yet.
Yeah, you should come to PAX East. Maybe we'll get you in the game.
I will be there. I believe I'll be there on Thursday and Sunday is what I'm trying to pull off anyway. I don't want to miss the System Wars panel. There we go. Insert shameless plug for the Gamer Assembly Tabletop System Wars panel Sunday at PAX. I can't remember when.
No, that was good though. Sunday.
Thanks. Sunday, Sunday, Sunday. Can I get some special effects like the monster truck rally behind that? All right. So myself, I'm Bob Smith. I've been. This is a little frightening. I had to sit down and think about it. I've been GMing games for about 36 years now, and I don't feel like I'm old enough to say that, but it's true. I started at an extremely young age. I had some cousins who pulled me into D&D. I was a very imaginative kid, so I threw dice around and mostly made stuff up and told stories, and they told me whether it worked or not or what happened, and I said, cool, I got to do this with my friends. So I told my mother all about it. She got me the Moldvay set, and I started running games. And I'm going to go ahead and guess that probably from age 6, maybe the first 4 or 5, 6 years of my dungeon mastering career, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I would read the books, and half the words in there I didn't know what they meant yet. I had to go look up the word hermit in the dictionary. I remember that being the first word, like, oh my God, this is such a cool word. What does this word mean? When I was reading B2, Keep on the Borderlands. And then the rumors table, didn't know what a rumor was. I'm 6 years old. So, yeah, I diversified pretty early and started playing other games, West End games, Star Wars, Paranoia. I discovered GURPS at a fairly young age. That affected me in a big way. You guys know all of that. And I'd say maybe for the past 8 or 9 years, I've been really big into the more indie games. And that's where a lot of my GMing, I think, skill has really flowered under these a little bit more free-flowing games. They tend to be more improvisational, a little more loosey-goosey with the rules. And I found that's a really good fit for me. So we get some background on each other. Let's go ahead and dive into the topic of the day, and that's that one thing. So, Matt, what is that one thing that you bring to games, your go-to move, or that thing that you can bring there to just crank the awesome knob up to 11?
So, the one thing I've been doing a lot with lately has been setting expectations before the start of a new campaign. Really talking about what we want both as a player and a DM to get out of the campaign, what kind of style as the DM I'm going to run the game as, and really make sure that everybody is on board for that. And if not, figure out what we can do to not step on their fun, my fun, or anybody else's fun. This is sometimes called a session zero. Sometimes it's called common sense. But really, Brian does not like that statement. But really, it's the sort of thing that formalizing into a pre-game session or a game session has been an interesting experiment to try and make the game better right from the start versus testing boundaries and figuring out exactly where we can fit things together.
And that's actually, it's a really important thing because there's a lot of different directions I think that things can go wrong. And it's not just making sure, okay, are we playing D&D? Are we playing Monster Hearts? That's obviously you got to get everyone on the same page there. But as you mentioned, stylistically, are we playing? Is this type of game going to be very collaborative, players throwing ideas out there and including it, or is it more of a Mother May I type game where the players are offering up things and the GM then just tells them what happens or whether or not they can do something? A lot of different directions. You've got you've got your rating, right? Is this a PG game? Is this a rated R game in terms of content that way? And then there's style of play, right? Are we doing Victorian high drama or are we playing murder hobos? I mean, I think if any of those things are off amongst the group, you've pretty much got a recipe for a train wreck or disappointment on somebody's part kind of right away.
And Bob, what's murder hobos? What does that mean?
Murder hobos is a very simple tabletop pen and paper RPG written by Brent Newhall, who's going to be joining the call very soon. No, that's actually a true statement. But Murder Hobos is
is it a true statement that Brent's going to join the call soon?
That's what he says.
Oh, hey, wow.
There he is.
Like
That's
magic.
Space right there.
I cast a spell. It was called Summon Brent. It's not a simple deal. That's like a level 5 spell. It's utterly exhausted and drained me.
Wow.
And for my next trick, I will summon Brent audio.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to have worked yet, but that's all right.
It's delayed. Finish telling us what murder hobos are.
Sure, and then I'll let Brent expound on that because he is a murder hobos expert. Murder hobos is a somewhat derogatory term for a style of gaming in which more or less the purpose of the fun is to go out, find things, kill them, and take their stuff. You then move on to the next place where you find things, kill them, and take their stuff. This is basically the game of D&D that most people will play until they hit about age 18 maybe, and a lot of people will go on a lot longer with that. And for some people, there's groups of 30 and 40-year-olds where that's just what they like to play. But it tends to be where a lot of gaming starts, I think, and some of it changes, some of it doesn't. But like I said, it's somewhat of a humorous and derogatory term for a very simplistic and form of D&D or any other game. But go somewhere, kill it, take its stuff, move on. That's a murder hobo.
And Bob, the other thing about setting expectations like this is that because D&D is a big tent, almost any kind of game can fit within the D&D rule set. It's doubly helpful because some people might expect D&D to, as you said, be murder hobos or be intercity intrigue, or expect players to start as wee little commoners and become conquerors and kings of nations that they will then drive forth and defeat all evil in the world.
Yeah, you're right about that big tent. And that's super important anytime you're gaming with people that you don't know intimately well. Right off the bat, you can hit a wall right away if you're running Victorian high intrigue and you got 5 people up there that at a convention that were expecting murder hobos. It's tough to, I think, express that in a 50-word game description what you were looking for. And so yeah, expectations is a huge thing. Brent, do you want to add anything about murder hobos or insert a shameless plug for your game?
Yeah, I am the guy here who wrote the game called Murder Hobos. So it's tough because I think there are lots of sides to the murder hobo term, because there are a lot of people who really look down on the idea of murder hoboing. One of the problems with murder hoboing is it is very straightforward, and there are lots of people for whom, you get home after a long day at work, and then you drive 45 minutes out to your friend's place to play D&D, you really don't have the mental capacity for high court intrigue for 4 hours. Sometimes you really just want something that's very straightforward. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. And there's also the fact that, like you were saying with con games, I don't know about you all, I've certainly been in con games where people wanted something very complex and interesting, and that wasn't what they got because it makes people at the table. A more murder hobo style game where there are very simple objectives and the way to get that is very clear can be a much more effective structure when you don't know who you're playing with. It's one of the reasons why I think a more murder hobo style game is not a bad idea when you're starting a campaign with folks you haven't played with for a long time, where you can kind of start with, okay, here's a simple set of things to do. The campaign may go in lots of different directions. It may be more complex, but it can start with these very simple, okay, there are goblins over there. They've overrun this temple, take it out. And then you can see through the characters' actions where they go from there.
And that's a great point. I think that at least in a crowd that people are sitting down and they want to play Dungeons and Dragons, I think you do have kind of a universal thing that even the tiniest amount of murder hoboing is killing monsters and receiving treasure is kind of the fundamental of the game. And I think everyone can enjoy that to a certain extent. People may tire of it and want more, but as kind of just setting a baseline, setting expectations, that's Matt's one thing. Let's whirl the camera over let's do Brian next. Brian,
right.
What is your one thing?
Wow. All right. Well, that was hard to follow, but my one thing is I'm going to say bring that not quite finished stat block with you. Now, this isn't going to apply to all games, but it's going to apply to quite a few where you have NPCs, perhaps even monsters. I know. And they require certain mathematical statistics in order to play. Now, oftentimes, because your players are human beings, they're going to surprise you with where they want to go and who they want to interact with. And
that's never happened to me.
Never happened? No?
I'm going to give you a hint as to where they are going to go. It's wherever you didn't prepare.
Right. And it's really easy in most game systems to tack on some basic stats as long as you already have a framework to play with. And if you've got something nice and generic, you can throw a few details on it and move. This is very similar to a concept called reskinning you hear a lot about, where people will say, all right, flip through your monster manual, find something that's close, and just change all the descriptions and use the math, which is viable, absolutely. But I often don't like the visual of having to do that. There's something about having just enough that you can move forward now and you can clean it up between sessions that keeps the energy moving, that makes things seem alive. So if you have that opportunity where you can build out a stat block but that's just like super generic, doesn't have any special abilities, that covers a nice range of difficulty for where you are, it can be so useful. In fact, in 4th edition D&D, that was exceptionally useful. You were actually able to have like full 30 level chart on one spreadsheet, so you could really pull numbers on the fly. So it's definitely more viable with some systems than others, but it's nice to have something that's not too specific planned, so you can just keep going and not have to flip through that book.
Yeah, so minus the specific details of flavor, special abilities, things like that. What type of information are you looking for in a generic stat block?
Absolutely. So what I want some very basic information, so I don't have to second guess myself when I start rolling. So if we're talking about a system like Dungeons and Dragons, you want to have, what's the average health for a monster or NPC at your player's level. If they're level 3, that's what you want your generic stat block to be. You want to have a common defense for them to hit if they're attacking. You want to know If they had a best skill, what number would it be? And if they had a mediocre skill, what number would it be? You're looking for things that you can easily attach names to. Even if you're just doing what's the average damage at this level, you don't know what the name of the weapon or attack is going to be, but you have a number there that you can work with. It really helps you improvise.
That's a big thing for me. Anything that helps with improvisation is definitely a tool that I'm always interested in using. Anything else you want to add about that?
Also, I think Matt was wrong. His whole idea was just incorrect. You shouldn't listen to him.
That's Tabletop System Wars, Brian, talking.
Oh, I'm sorry. I got carried away. I'm thinking ahead of myself.
Wrong podcast.
Wrong podcast.
I was just going to actually add on to that. There's a guy named Runehammer on YouTube, and he does a video called Fluid Fundamentals. And the idea behind that is to come up with ideas for how to run D&D with players where you don't have to prep everything ahead of time. And one of his suggestions on that, for 5th edition especially, is a concept called take 10s, where for the monsters at low levels, if you need to throw a monster at your party, all their stats are 10, AC 10, hit points 10, attributes are 10, and they have a +0 in everything. And that's something you can keep in your head. And as you're thinking of your monster, thinking, oh, well, they're a little tougher, okay, then their armor class is going to be up a little bit, or this stat is going to be down a little bit. And so you can modify that idea or those numbers and then to specialize those creatures. But it's kind of a nice way of keeping that in your head. My suggestion is kind of an odd one. My big suggestion is factions. When I'm building up a campaign for my players, I don't plan it out ahead of time. I don't think what's going to happen in the future. I will often think about cool stuff I would like to happen in the future. If I want airships, I write down airships and say, let's figure out a way of getting airships in here. But I focus on the factions involved in the world, the factions that the characters are actually going to be involved with, both positive and negative, often both in the same faction, and come up with who's involved in that faction, what do they want, and what are they actually doing in the world. And once I've nailed down those things, that actually gives me a pretty good structure for a pretty good set of information for what the campaign is going to be and what the players have to, or what the player characters have to do next.
And you raised a really good point there about the ones that the players are going to interact with. I think it's really important as a GM, especially if you're newer, don't waste cycles, your precious prep cycles, on stuff that's never going to come out in the game, unless you're entertaining yourself with it. If you find it entertaining and it's enjoyable for you, by all means do it. Don't be disappointed if it never comes out in play. And this immediately makes me think of the typical Paizo adventure path. They are wonderfully written, tons and tons and tons of background information, 90% of which is never going to come out to the players, but it could be very enjoyable for the GM if that's your thing.
Yeah. And that's also a great point about, I think, how much to prep. There's actually a video by, I think, Jeremy Crawford over at the D&D YouTube channel, where he talks about how much. He always gets the question, how much should you prep for D&D? And he says his recommendation is to prep half as much time as the expected play session for the stuff that the players actually are going to be dealing with. Anything beyond that, you can certainly do prep. You can certainly plan for things. You can certainly work for things. But beyond that, you should be thinking in the back of your mind, how much am I thinking through every possible scenario versus the stuff that I really need for that session? I think it's a pretty good, rubric.
Yeah.
That also gets into another issue that DMs can run into, where they've spent so much time in the headspace of their world, they assume their players know it all when they haven't presented it to them.
That's a good point.
And you don't want to do that, because your players will be lost and confused. And they're also probably not going to read the 20-page background you have developed for the town that they may or may not visit.
Then they're not going to pass the test at the beginning of the session.
So that actually is a great segue, very closely related to my one thing. And so my one thing, I call it three things. And so three things is a very useful tool for introducing almost anything, especially things off the cuff. So three things about a thing. So let's take in the case of an NPC. They've just met the baker, and you need to describe the baker. So let's say you have a name. Names are probably the hardest thing to think up of in the moment. So I cheat. I always have a page full of names right in front of me. So I write that name down real quick on my index card, decide male, female, ancestry, whatever we want to go with. And then I'm just going to pull three things out of thin air, something about the way they look, the way they sound, a quality of the voice, an accent, something about their physical stature. Maybe they're hunched over and old, and maybe very young, broad-shouldered and overconfident. Something about how they look, their personality, physical appearance, just any three things. And what I've found is that three things is really all it tends to take to engage the imagination of somebody at the table. It lets them engage their imagination senses, if you will, and bring that character to life in their own head. And you don't fall in the trap of going overboard with it, because whatever you describe, each player is going to have a different vision of that in their head. It'll be based on what you're describing, but it's not going to be exactly the same. And that's kind of where the power of imagination comes into. So the less that you can put into it while engaging that imagination and getting them going, the better off you are, because it requires less effort. A person's own ideas are more interesting to them than your ideas are. And so the background that you put into your campaign, it's far more interesting to you than it's going to be to anyone at the table. Three things is a tool I use so that I can always have something interesting no matter where the players decide to go. And the players are typically not going to decide, my experience, they're not always going to decide that one NPC that you've really fleshed out that's integral to the story, that's who they want to interact with. They may decide to interact with the baker because maybe there was something in the description that they really liked. And so less preparation on that description lets the players kind of decide what's interesting to them. And that's what kind of, hooks them in. You can use this technique for anything. You could describe a sword or a magic item with it, a building, a society. I kind of wrap all that up and I say, all it takes is three things, and anybody can think of three things.
Do you include like plot hooks in one of those three things?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a very improvisational GM, so I tend to really rely on ideas the players are throwing out, as we play. Little aside comment jokes or something like that. A particularly silly example was somebody in a Dungeon World game threw a comment out there about how kobolds were afraid of socks. Kind of as an overbroad stereotype. And I just said, I'm like, yeah, exactly. Kobolds are absolutely terrified of socks. And I let them fill in the blanks after that as to why. But something I've encouraged newbie GMs who want to try improvising I consider this a low pressure way, is start a murder mystery without yourself having any idea who actually did it, and just listen. You can narrate this whole thing and guide them from scene to scene to scene. They're driving the entire thing, and at some point when somebody says something like, yeah, that sounds about right, that's what's actually happening. And when someone, especially in a mystery, when someone finds out that their idea was really the mystery, they feel like, I figured it out, I solved it, my idea, me. It's a great experience. So the more you can
with
get.
Beaker very often?
Do I play with who?
Beaker, the Muppet.
Oh.
Yeah.
No, but if you've seen me GM, I often look a lot like the Swedish Chef, the way I'm moving around behind the screen, climbing up on chairs. I'm fairly animated. But yeah, so those keys, the less prep, the better for me. Three things is one of my biggest cheating tools, besides stealing mercilessly from every trope, TV show, book, movie, and player idea thrown out at the table. Why reinvent the wheel? I've always said this, you know what? I'm not George R.R. Martin. I'm never going to be. All the ideas that I might come up with, all the good ones are probably already out there, so might as well grab them and as a Brian said reskin everything. You get a lot of mileage out of that. So reskinning in 3 things, that's a month worth of sessions right there.
And you touch on a really important point too about player attention. One of the mistakes I think new DMs often make is that they'll describe a town and describe things that aren't important to the plot, and the players will immediately leap on those things and follow those threads. What you place in front of your player characters, they will assume are the most important things in the game.
Yeah.
So you be aware of how you're driving that attention, because if you just really like how this one place is and describe it in detail, they will assume that is where the count is actually layering or what have you.
Right. Why else would you have so much to say about it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there's one of my other techniques and I don't mean to flood it with my techniques, but we're talking about that level of detail. The more you get the players to contribute, the better. And you can just be lazy, right? If they're walking past a building and you say, well, you're going past the stables on the left. Does it actually matter what the stables look like or what the experience is? Not really. You just want to get something in their head. Throw it to somebody else at the table. So, what's it look like? Tell me about the stable. And in a way, it engages them, pulls them into the story, but there's a subtle communication that you're giving them there that this isn't important.
Wow.
But we're going to have some narration and some color and some imagination here, but I'm sending you a very clear message that I don't care what this thing is, but let's have some fun with it.
That's rough.
That's interesting.
I don't like that in the least bit. In fact, I would say that the opposite happens at my table. If I'm asking you to name something or come up with some quirks or description for something, that means that I'm absolutely going to use it, and it's absolutely going to become important because I'm soliciting your direct feedback.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But it's probably just because I like my players more than you do.
Oh no. Well, it depends on the player. But,
Yeah.
So I do use it in both directions. So a lot of my plots, a lot of things are definitely player driven. But again, it all goes back to being lazy. I don't like to prepare. So the more contributions I can get from everyone else, the better. Make it a collaborative experience. I'm the GM and I'm doing all this work here, but I don't also bring the pizza for everybody myself. So everybody else can, if they're chipping in for food, they can chip in for story too.
That's right.
Absolutely.
So I guess one final quick roundtable. What's everybody playing right now? Not literally right now, because obviously none of us are playing. But...
Yeah, I'm playing Podcast the RPG.
You better get on it and write that, Brent.
Ooh, that's not good. Yeah. Right now I am running 2 campaigns of D&D 5th edition. One is with a very creative group of friends, and the other is with my bosses at work.
Who are not creative.
They are.
Friends.
This is their first tabletop role-playing game experience, and getting them into the mindset. They are creative, but they don't have any of the background and experiences in how all this should go. And so it's been really interesting watching them figure out how that they have complete freedom to run this any way they want. And oh boy, once they figure that out, it's gone in some interesting directions. Yeah,
it always does. I refer to that as new player syndrome. It's somewhat predictable in the types of behavior they'll engage in.
Yep.
But, Brian, what are you playing right now?
So right now my D&D game is on hiatus, but as we mentioned earlier, I am running a Monster Hearts game. So that's pretty fun. For those of you out there who don't know what that is, it's kind of like Buffy the Vampire Slayer with more gay kissing.
Yep.
Steamy Teenage Monsters would be a great alternative title for Monster Hearts. And I like Monster Hearts. It poses a serious conundrum. It says, okay, you're a teenager and you got to deal with all of that crap of being a teenager. You're also a monster.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? And great role playing opportunities in there.
Mm-hmm.
Matt, what are you playing?
So I'm currently running a 5th edition campaign, and then I have 2 AD&D 2nd edition campaigns that I play in off weeks.
Nice. It's a lot of games. My gaming has dried up quite a bit over the last I guess the last year, life has just kind of gotten in the way. I jumped back in the saddle last week. I was a guest GM at another group's spot, and
Cool.
I thought of this. I'm sitting right next to me. I ran inspectors for them. So a wonderfully improvisational game that requires absolutely zero preparation. I think everybody enjoyed the session. They wanted a little bit of a palate cleanser. They're playing Shadowrun, and they're transitioning from the actual Shadowrun rules to a complete hack job based on Cortex. And
Oh,
so,
cool.
yeah, so I've been helping the GM with a lot of the work around kind of translating everything into Cortex. But
What
yeah,
is Inspectors?
so Inspectors is, you can best summarize it as Ghostbusters the game. It is a humorous game, so I don't know how well it would work if played deadpan, but it works wonderfully on the funny side of things. The players are the employees and or owners of a paranormal battling franchise, and due to money constraints, they have also sold themselves out and are a reality TV show.
Nice.
So it's a great combination of ideas, and it's really fun to play. Requires no preparation. You can play a 2-hour session at the drop of a hat. All you need is some people who like to have fun. Really.
I have experienced or come across that game played without the reality TV show and relatively straight, and it worked fairly well from what I heard.
Yeah, I find the reality show component to be so much fun. The way it works is that at any one point during a session, a player can call a confessional. And
Mhm.
so then we all gather around, and as we are the audience, and they are talking directly to the camera, but their confessional is taking place after this adventure.
Right.
So whatever they say in there is going to come true, and it can be a kind of a great way to hose some of your fellow players and make sure that certain humorous things or funny things happen. Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
And when he broke his leg,
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. There's one of those leading questions. You're establishing the leading question, and then we play to find out how it happened.
Mhm.
So I guess that'll wrap us up for this edition of Gamer Assembly Presents That One Thing. I'm Bob Smith.
I'm Brent.
I'm Matt Miranda.
I'm Brian LaBerge.
Good gaming, everybody. Or I can do his introduction. Brent's name is Brent. He's been playing games for 375 years. Don't let the full head of hair fool you. He's actually quite older than I am, and that's key. His favorite RPG is GURPS. He loves GURPS. He loves all of the overly complicated rules of GURPS and the needless complexity and all
Right.
that. I'm actually projecting the other side of me onto him, and I'm going to pause here because I got a printer going off next to me.
I know Brent's least favorite bit of GM work is world building. Absolutely hates it. Wants to use out of the box settings as much as possible.